In today's video, we will be talking about shading your miniatures, why shading is important, the different ways you can achieve it, the advantages and disadvantages of the different methods, and which one you should use in which situation. After watching this video, you should know enough to start competently shading your own minis and producing much better looking figures.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Fallon's Miniatures.
So let's start with the basics first. What is this shading thing and why you should bother with it?
To put it simply, shading is a trick miniature painters use to create more definition and contrast on the model, defining the boundaries between various elements and making it easier for your eyes to figure out what is what on the mini. You could say that shading is the dark side of highlighting, and the two methods work hand in hand to create a well-defined mini that looks awesome on the tabletop or in the display case.
So if you want to paint pretty miniatures, it's time to join the dark side and let the shades flow through you.
Essentially, the way this works is that our eyes interpret objects based on where the lights and the shadows appear on them. All the details on an object, let's say an armor trim, a knee pad, or a fold in a cape, cast some natural shadows and have some highlights. If those are missing, our eyes will just see a mess of color and won't be able to interpret where one thing starts and the other ends.
But at this point you could be asking, Zoltan, why do I need to artificially create shadows on my mini? Doesn't that just happen naturally?
And the answer is yes, it does, but it's much more obvious on big objects. The smaller the mini, the less obvious the shadows become. The same thing happens on objects that are far away from you, and you can't make out the details. Look at this loincloth thingy on the Emperor's Children Chaos Marine I painted recently. Before the shading it looks quite flat, but then when I use a simple wash for creating the shading, the cloth becomes immediately more defined even without painting in the highlights. So the conclusion is that in order to achieve the right amount of definition on a mini, the shadows and the highlights need to be somewhat exaggerated. This will trick your eyes into thinking that you are looking at something lifelike and not just a small plastic figure.
Okay, so we established that shading is quite essential if you want to paint nice looking models. Now the question is, how can you actually do it? And there are actually a lot of different ways to achieve shading, so let's go through the 8 methods I use, see how to do them, what their advantages and disadvantages are, and when you should use them. Number 1, and probably the most well-known one, is shading with washes. The same method you have just seen me do on the CSM loincloth.
This is the method a lot of people start out with, mainly because it's quite simple to understand and do, plus the Games Workshop painting guides are pointing beginners in this direction, with a lot of companies, including Games Workshop itself, producing specialized products for it. If you have spent even just a little time in the hobby, you have most likely come across non-oil and Raglan flash shade at least. Using this method is quite straightforward. You paint in the base color of the element you want to shade and then you apply the wash all over it. And since these products are formulated in a way to flow into the recesses and folds, they will do just that, and when they dry, they will make the places they pulled in darker.
This is great since they are very low effort and don't require a lot of time, so they are perfect if you want to paint some models fast, but if you care about quality, there are a ton of downsides.
Most of the time washes are meant to go over the entire surface and not just the shadow areas. They will darken the deeper areas more, but they will also darken down and stain the rest of the surface as well. So after applying them, you generally have to repaint the entire surface that is not in shadow. Applying them is quite fast, but they tend to dry much slower than normal acrylic paints, so you will have to wait quite some time depending on how big the surface is before you can start working on it again. By their nature, they are uncontrolled and messy. You can be careful in their application, but in the end, they will just go wherever they want, even if you don't really want them there. They also tend to dry blotchy, creating dark patches and patterns where you don't want them to be. And while it's true that shadows are mostly at the bottom of things in recesses and folds, it's not always the case. For example, on a cape, the light coming from above would actually also hit the bottom of the folds and not just the top. But a wash will not care about that and will just flow into the fold, darkening it down, resulting in a quite unnatural looking paint job. But it still looks better than without any shading.
In general, washes are fantastic for surfaces that have a lot of details and texture, like furs for example. But they don't perform particularly well on big volumetric elements like capes, and you should only use them on entire models if you care more about the quantity than the quality. The number 2 method is quite similar, but instead of using acrylic wash products, you use oil and enamel washes.
You either use some simple artist oil paints mixed with thinner or some dedicated enamel products for this, but the process is the same as with the previous one, with a couple of important differences. Oils take a very long time to dry even compared to acrylic washes, and unlike acrylics, they can be easily removed from the model before they are fully dried. This allows you to paint them over the entire surface, letting them flow into the deeper areas, but then you can simply wipe them from the raised areas with some thinner and a piece of foam, for example. This means that you don't have to repaint the entire surface after the wash stage, and you can apply the wash even as the last step in your process, since it won't stain and destroy any highlighting you had done before. But the downside is that you will have to wait for them to dry fully before you can start painting again, which can take a very long time indeed, even days. And with most of them, water will not be enough. You need to thin them with white spirits or something similar. And of course, this method still suffers from the other issues that I already mentioned regarding acrylic washes. They are still quite uncontrolled and flow where they want, including into places that should not actually have shadows. But even taking all the disadvantages into account, oil washes are still superior to acrylic ones in many ways, and the reason people are not using them more is mostly due to them being unfamiliar with oil paints in general. But other than having to use a thinner, oils are not that much more complicated than acrylics, so they are definitely worth giving a try.
Before I move on to some more advanced techniques, let's talk about the third type of shading, contrast paints. This method is still relatively new and it's actually quite similar to washes, but in a way it's even simpler.
Contrast paints take care of painting the shadows, the midtones and highlights in essentially a single step. They are super fast and easy to use, but similarly to the previous methods, they also suffer from being uncontrolled and messy. And while they will create contrast on the model as the name suggests, they will create nowhere near enough compared to some more advanced techniques. Initially, you only had the Citadel contrast range to work with, but nowadays almost every major paint brand has their contrast equivalent under different names like Express Color from Vallejo, for example. They are meant to be applied on top of a white or Zenithal primer, and similarly to washes, they will pull in the recesses and shadows, making them darker while also creating some basic highlights on top of the various elements since they flow away from there, staining the surface but not covering it fully. They come with all the advantages and disadvantages of washes, except that they are even faster since you don't have to paint the surface before applying them, and you also don't have to repaint them after like you do with washes. The end result will be messy and inaccurate, but it will be still much better than without shading and highlighting, and nothing beats the ease of use and speed of contrast paints. My personal favorite way to use contrast paints for shading is slightly different from the usual though. Instead of using them on top of a white primer to establish both the midtone and the shadows, I like to use traditional acrylics to establish the midtone and then use contrast colors to shade them, just like you would do with a standard wash. The contrast will create much nicer and colorful tones on the mini than a wash would, but it will establish the shadows just as well. In essence, if you want to paint some models fast, using contrast paints in some form is probably the best method for you. And even if you want to go for a quality paint job, they can still be used as a great initial step, especially on some textural surfaces.
With that, let's move on to the number 4 method of shading, zenithal priming or underpainting.
This method is quite versatile and can be used for various purposes, not just shading, but highlighting and sketching as well. And sometimes I simply use it to create more vibrant colors. I have a detailed guide on zenithal priming on the channel, so if you're interested, check that out for a more in-depth explanation. I will link it in the description below. But basically, zenithal underpainting means that first you prime your model in a dark color and then you spray a much brighter color, usually white, from above from a zenithal angle, painting all the upward-facing surfaces white but leaving the shadows dark, while also creating a bit of organic transition between them. Once done, you paint or spray the base coat you want over this black and white underpainting, and since acrylic paint is translucent, this will result in dark colors in the shadows and lighter colors in the highlights, creating immediate contrast. This method is great for creating a quick sketch for volumetric highlights, but the end result is not perfect in terms of light and shadow placement, and the contrast, the difference between light and shadow areas, is not high enough for a final result, so this needs to be combined with other methods to work. In a way, this is the exact opposite of washes, since it creates more or less correct volumetric highlights, but destroys recess shading, because the airbrush won't respect the recesses and will spray anything facing up white. In the end, zenithal underpainting alone is not really enough to produce a good enough shading on the model, but it can be combined with some of the other methods to create a nicely shaded end result. For example, you can simply layer over it to enhance the contrast further, or apply the zenithal before using contrast paints to improve the organic contrast that those create.
Moving on to number 5, we have the dreaded glazing. Glazing is a somewhat laborious but very precise method of changing the brightness and tone of your previously painted surfaces by applying lots of layers of very thin down and translucent paint over them. This can be used to both darken and brighten the surface, so you can use it for both shading and highlighting.
Glazing is quite simple on paper, but to do it successfully it requires quite a bit of practice and some advanced understanding of thinning your paints and brush control. Ultimately, it is not as difficult as it seems, but many people shy away from it. It requires you to paint a mid-color on a surface you want to paint, something that is the middle of the road in terms of brightness between your intended shadows and highlights. Then you take either a darker version of that same color, for example by mixing in some black, or another darker color that would look good in the shadows. You then thin the color down significantly, remove most of the moisture on a paper towel, and then drag the paint from the mid-tone towards where you want the shadows to be. The more layers you apply, the darker the end result will be, while also creating a transition between the mid-tone and the shadows. It is slow, it is tedious, and it requires more advanced knowledge than any of the previous methods, but it is also very precise, goes exactly where you want it to, and done right, it will produce the best possible results. So if you want to go for quality over quantity, this is a method you should definitely try and learn.
Number 6 is quite easy and fast, but lots of people consider it very complicated and are afraid of it. I'm talking about shading with an airbrush.
This method requires you to have an airbrush and to be somewhat familiar and experienced with it. Then you need to have some faith and confidence in the method, since you will be spraying some dark colors on the models after you had at least partially or maybe even fully painted them. The idea is actually almost the opposite of a Zenithal highlight. First, you paint the surface of the entire model, including the midtone and some or all of the highlights. Then you take the airbrush and load it with the paint you would like to use in the shadows. This should be darker than your midtones, of course, and ideally you should dilute it quite heavily. Contrast paints and inks are perfect for this, since they flow nicely through the airbrush and they are quite transparent by default. With the paint loaded, you start spraying the underside of the model from an angle that is the opposite of what you would use for a Zenithal, essentially from the bottom at a 45-degree angle.
This will create some great volumetric shadows and nice transitions between the midtones and the dark areas, but it's also limited by what an airbrush can do.
This won't go into the crevices and nooks of the model, for example, so those you have to paint by hand. It's also quite possible that you would create some overspray and you would have to correct the highlights you had created earlier after the airbrushing phase. This is definitely a somewhat high-end technique, which is almost a must for display quality models, but it can also be used for batch painting. A couple of quick bursts from below with an airbrush can create some striking shadows on any model even without too much precision, making your line troops look better painted than they actually are.
Number 7 is another method that seems much more intimidating than it actually is: black lining or panel lining.
Some of the previous methods like washes and contrast paints are pretty good at creating dark recesses and separation lines between elements, while others like Zenithal underpainting and glazes are better for volumes, but they tend to lighten up recesses instead of creating shadows in them. In this case, black lining or panel lining will be your best friend. Essentially, black lining is exactly what it sounds like, drawing a dark but not necessarily black line on the boundary between elements to separate them and to darken the recesses on the model. You can use simple acrylic paint and a sharp brush for this if you have the brush control for it, or you can use dedicated panel lining products or an oil wash which will flow into the recesses automatically due to their low surface tension. Even if you don't use any other shading method, a simple black lining will create a ton of contrast and will go a long way towards defining the elements of the model. It might be a tedious and a somewhat scary looking method, but as usual it becomes much easier with some practice, and if you want to paint some display quality models, it's absolutely essential to learn it. For batch painters though, this is not really necessary, since they will probably use washes or contrast paints which already take care of the recesses.
Finally, we reach number 8, which is simply painting from black and layering up without painting the shadows.
Most of the other methods start from either a midtone or even white on the model and then create the shadows after, but you can do the opposite too. You can start from black or a very dark shadow color and layer up from there without destroying the shadows in the process. This of course requires quite a bit of precision to avoid painting over some of the shadow areas. For example, it's quite likely that you will still cover some of the recesses with lighter paints, but that can be easily fixed by some minimal black lining in the end. Most of the time you would also not just leave the shadows as they are, and you would probably glaze over them at least partially with some other colors and probably add some other tones or textures to create some visual interest. This method is of course more suited for painting higher quality models, but combined with some of the other methods can lead to some pretty good results, and I find myself using it a lot.
And that's it. These are all the methods I currently use to shade my miniatures. I hope watching this video helped you understand a little better why you should also shade your minis and what methods you can use to do so. My advice is to try out all of them and combine them for the best possible results. And if you're a veteran painter, please let us know in the comments if I left something out or got something wrong. Thanks so much for watching, and see you guys in the next one.